Hi, my presentation will be on the Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution began on August 14, 1791 and ended on January 1st, 1804. It lasted for about 13 years. What was the Haitian Revolution? The Haitian Revolution basically was a series of conflicts led by former enslaved Africans, mainly from Western Africa. They did this in hopes of dismantling the powerful French regime. Where did the Haitian Revolution take place? The Haitian Revolution occurred in Saint-Domingue. Saint-Domingue, after gaining its independence, was then renamed to Haiti. Saint-Domingue before was a Western French colony of Hispaniola from 1659 to 1804, and they also shared the island with the Spanish-controlled colony Santo Domingo, also known as the Dominican Republic. At the bottom left-hand corner is the French version of the map of French Saint-Domingue and Spanish Santo Domingo, and in the right upper hand corner is the translated version. Here's a map showing Central America and the Caribbean islands. The red circle with the red arrow pointing into it points to where Saint-Domingue would be located, but we now know this place as present-day Haiti. What was it like in Saint-Domingue before 1791? Saint-Domingue actually became the most lucrative colony of France because of its exploitation of slaves. The main religion practiced there was Roman Catholicism. Government was an absolute monarchy until 1792, so right after the revolution, it then switched to a republic. Saint-Domingue's majority of the population was made up of slaves. It was funny because the slaves outnumbered everyone by about 10 to 1, and I believe that they could have taken over, but with the lack of resources, they were hesitant in the lack of inspiration. The exploitation of slaves came with much success and growth of many industries, including the sugar, coffee, and indigo industries. They produced 40% of the world's sugar and produced 60% of the world's coffee. The French Revolution's impact actually split the white population as well into royalist and revolutionary factions. And this information was found on countrystudies.us. Saint-Domingue's demographic in the 18th century. There were 30,000 whites, also known as either the Grand Blancs or the Petit Blancs. There were 30,000 free people of color, half of them known as mulattoes, who were racially mixed people, and they usually had a white father and a black mother. The white father would be a French colonist, and the black mother would be one of the slaves. And lastly, a whopping 500,000 slaves. They made up 89.28% of the population. And like I said previously in the last slide, they were the majority. Colonial society in Saint-Domingue in the 18th century. Colonial society in Saint-Domingue were separated into three main social groups: the whites, the Grand Blancs or the Petit Blancs, the free people of color, or the slaves. The Grand Blancs were mainly wealthy planters who owned plantation and slaves, and they were at the top of the hierarchy. Right below them, though, were the free people of color. These were either 1, wealthy mulattoes, or 2, free people of color who bought their freedom or were given their freedom from their masters for whatever reason. The free people of color were often quite wealthy, specifically the mulattoes, and they contributed a lot to the island's stability by joining the militia or paramilitary. Right below the free people of color would be the Petit Blancs, and these were the poor and less powerful white colonists. They worked as artisans, shopkeepers, and teachers of the island. And at the very bottom of the social hierarchy would be the slaves. They were split into two categories. 1, the domestic slaves who worked as cooks or personal servants, or 2, field slaves who worked out in the fields and experienced the most cruelty. They sometimes were treated worse than the farm animals. All this information was found on faculty.webster.edu. What was slavery like in Saint-Domingue? By the middle of the 18th century, Saint-Domingue had become the largest slave society of the region. Due to the conditions slaves were subjected to and had to work through, such as overwork, disease, being underfed, there were higher death rates than birth rates, especially in the north. Slaves lived in horrible conditions, such as windowless huts, and they were oftentimes whipped and beaten. And right after, as an extra punishment, would have salt, pepper, or ashes poured onto their fresh wounds. All of this information was found on wikipedia.org explaining the brutality that the slaves had to suffer. Here are a few images of what slavery looked like in Saint-Domingue. What started the Haitian unrest in 1789? The unrest among slaves began from a rumor they overheard that the King of France, Louis XVI, had quote-unquote freed them. The changes happening in France during this time were overheard in Saint-Domingue, and it gave the free people of color and the slaves hope for equal rights and freedom finally. And at this time, the Declaration of the Rights of the Man and of the Citizen was adopted in 1789, and it proclaimed men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Also, inspiration from the French Revolution sparked some more unrest, and this began the initial stages of the revolt. At the same time, the Petit Blancs believed people of color weren't receiving enough discrimination. Here's a picture of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Why did the Haitian Revolution start in the first place? Some of the main causes that instigated the Haitian Revolution was 1. The mulattoes were frustrated with the racist and segregated society. 2. Turmoil rising in Saint-Domingue from the French Revolution. 3. Nationalistic voodoo ceremonies. 4. The ongoing wars that were going on between the European powers. And 5. The never-ending brutality from the slave owners. Here's a picture of a voodoo ceremony happening. Voodoo was an African religious tradition with elements of Catholicism, and it became a source of resistance and unity against the French. How did the Haitian Revolution begin? Through the inspiration of the French Revolution, it brought its influence over into the Haitian Revolution, actually. It started when the General Assembly adopted legislation that gave autonomy at a local level, but only people who were wealthy and owned property could participate. So this would mean the Grand Blancs and the mulattoes. It excluded the Petit Blancs, and they were very, very enraged. This actually caused a bunch of conflicts between the Petit Blancs and the free people of color because the Petit Blancs believed they were the most oppressed in society. They didn't even think of the slaves or the free people of color as people whatsoever. Also, the legislation provoked a three-sided civil war and soon a four-sided war when the slaves challenged all of them because they were sick and tired of how they were treated in society. All of this was found on blackpast.org for the Haitian Revolution. Toussaint Louverture, a former slave, Toussaint Louverture was one of the first people to lead an official rebellion against the planters. He led one on August 21st, 1791. But despite the French troops there, Louverture and his army were able to take over a third of the island. And in 1798, the French and the British troops actually withdrew from the battle. By 1801, he conquered the Spanish colony Santo Domingo. He abolished slavery and declared himself, quote-unquote, Governor General for life. Napoleon Bonaparte, being the ruler of France at the time, heard the commotion over on the island of Hispaniola. He then sent his brother-in-law, General Charles Leclerc, along with French troops to capture Louverture. Bonaparte sought to return Saint-Domingue back to French rule and to reinstate slavery. Louverture was soon seized and sent to France, where he would die in prison in 1803. How did Louverture defeat the French, Spanish, and the English? Louverture began joining forces with the Spanish against the French. He would get on the Spanish forces' good side and rose to very high ranks. When France abolished slavery, he immediately switched sides. After that, he would become Governor General in Saint-Domingue and force the British troops to withdraw. Here's a picture of Louverture. Jean-Jacques Dessalines. A former slave himself as well, Dessalines was second in command under Louverture. Because of Dessalines' military skills, they were actually able to take over Spanish colony Santo Domingo. He was appointed governor of the South by Louverture right after. After Louverture was taken away, he emerged as commander-in-chief, and in 1802, Dessalines tricked the French into trusting him by pretending to be on their side. However, it was only to give Dessalines and the slaves enough time to regroup themselves and to lead the last revolt. The French troops surrendered in defeat of the Battle of Vertières on November 18, 1803. Here's a picture of Dessalines. Haiti's victory and independence. On January 1st, 1804, Dessalines declares independence of Saint-Domingue from France. He would rename it Haiti after the original Arawak name. The Haitian Revolution ended finally with a victory for the slaves. Haiti then emerged as the first Black republic founded by former slaves, and the second nation to gain independence from a European power after the US. And this is the end of my presentation. Thank you.